Louis XIV was called the most beautiful king in European history. Perfect physique, godlike charisma, could dance ballet for 6 hours straight without breaking a sweat. That's not an exaggeration. From the very beginning of his reign, Louis XIV was more than a man. He was a performance, a spectacle, a symbol of everything divine and untouchable. Courtiers whispered that his presence radiated like sunlight itself, and soon he earned the title that would follow him through eternity, the Sun King. Yet, even at the height of his glory, cracks existed beneath the surface. While the world praised his perfection, Louis suffered quietly from ailments he concealed with layers of protocol and perfume. Constipation plagued him, requiring daily enemas. His breath was foul from rotting teeth. His oily skin shone not only from health but from imbalance. But these were carefully hidden. Curtains, perfumes, and etiquette shielded courtiers from reality. The Sun King could not be seen as ordinary, much less diseased. To admit weakness would be to tarnish the myth. How was we able to hide all of this pain beneath that excellence? Let us find out. But before we get into this, tell me, where are you watching this from? And if this story of the glorious Sun King piques your curiosity like mine, hit that subscribe button and like the video. Now let's rewind to how this moment started. Louis was only 4 years old when he inherited the throne of France. A child king, delicate and unformed, seemed a recipe for disaster. Yet, as he grew, he transformed into something that felt more than mortal. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with striking auburn hair and skin said to glow under candlelight. His eyes were sharp, commanding but playful, capable of both melting charm and ruthless intimidation. He wasn't just beautiful. He was relentless. From his teenage years, Louis pushed his body to perfection. He trained in fencing, horsemanship, and ballet. Not the casual dancing of courtiers, but punishing, athletic routines designed to display stamina and mastery. He could dance ballet for 6 straight hours without breaking a sweat. Imagine the spectacle, courtiers collapsing from exhaustion while the king glided across the floor, radiant, tireless, divine. Louis possessed not only physical gifts but a mind finely tuned to power. He could memorize entire conversations, recall genealogies, and speak with wit that left ambassadors stumbling. He spoke multiple languages fluently, played musical instruments, and wrote poetry with ease. Every skill was sharpened to reinforce the idea that he was not simply a ruler by inheritance, but by destiny. Ambassadors returned to their homelands with stories of him, often breathless. They wrote of his posture, his grace, his overwhelming presence in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Some described him as a demigod, others as a lion disguised as a man. They agreed on one thing: no monarch alive could compare. The court responded with worship. When Louis walked, courtiers bowed lower, held their breath longer, and competed desperately for his glance. He turned Versailles into a stage where every gaze, every gesture, every pause was orchestrated to glorify the king. He was not a man of flesh but a star, pulling the entire solar system of France around him. To his people and to Europe at large, Louis XIV projected flawless strength. His physique was strong, his charisma dazzling, his authority unquestioned. Versailles itself was built as an extension of this illusion, gardens stretching into infinity, golden halls that mirrored his light, fountains that seemed to obey his will. This image was not accidental. Louis understood the power of theater. He wore heels to increase his height, powdered his skin until it glowed, and adorned himself in jewels and silks so that every movement shimmered. Even his daily routine became a ritualized spectacle, the lever, rising, and coucher, retiring, ceremonies where courtiers fought for the honor of watching him wake or go to bed. Every action was meant to reinforce the message: Louis was not merely human. He was chosen, divine, eternal. The role of ballet in Louis's identity cannot be overstated. He didn't simply watch performances, he starred in them. Dressed as Apollo, the sun god, Louis danced on stage, embodying light itself. His court cheered, not only for his skill but for the symbolism. Louis was Apollo. Louis was the sun. 6 hours of dance without pause, without sweat, left the audience gasping. It wasn't just athleticism, it was proof of his otherworldliness. In an era when most monarchs were obese, gout-ridden, and clumsy, Louis moved like perfection incarnate. He was a living rebuke to weakness, a god among mortals. Everything in Versailles was built to orbit him. Courtiers structured their lives around his routines. Nobles abandoned their estates to bask in his presence, eager for crumbs of favor. The gardens, the architecture, the endless mirrors, all reflected one thing: Louis, the sun at the center of France. His charisma wasn't confined to the palace. Across Europe, he became the image of absolute monarchy. Princes imitated his fashions. Monarchs envied his splendor. Artists painted him with the radiance of a deity. For decades, Louis was not merely admired. He was worshipped. So the illusion continued. The radiant king, flawless and godlike, ruling over a golden century. For decades, Louis XIV embodied the dream of monarchy, absolute, unchallenged, eternal. To stand in his presence was to feel insignificant. To speak with him was to risk being blinded by brilliance. Versailles became the beating heart of European culture, a world of glitter, dance, and music. And at the center, always, was Louis, the man who believed, and made others believe, that he was more than flesh. But illusions cannot last forever. Behind the silks and perfumes, the oils and jewels, the Sun King's body was already beginning its slow rebellion. Perfection was an act, and acts eventually end. At Versailles, Louis XIV shone like the sun itself. His courtiers saw a dazzling king, tall, graceful, perfumed, dressed in silks and diamonds. But behind the carefully arranged curtains, behind the rituals and perfumes, the Sun King's body was already betraying him. The cracks in perfection were not visible from the gilded balconies, but they were there, festering quietly, waiting to rot the godlike image from within. Louis XIV lived in an age when water was mistrusted. Physicians claimed that bathing opened the pores to sickness. Louis himself believed it. He rarely, if ever, took full baths. Instead, he masked his body with layers of perfume and powder. This created an illusion of radiance but carried a stench hidden beneath the roses and ambergris. Courtiers noted that the king's body left traces of oil and musk on furniture, that his skin sometimes glistened not from health, but from grease and sweat never washed away. He was the most perfumed man in Europe, and one of the least clean. Louis adored food, and food adored him too much in return. His meals were legendary: mountains of roast meat, rivers of wine, baskets of bread, towers of pastries. He would eat until his stomach bulged against his jeweled robes, then rise and dance as though nothing had happened. But his digestion suffered. Chronic constipation haunted him. Every morning, the king required enemas to move his bowels. Not once or twice, but thousands upon thousands over his lifetime. Courtiers whispered of physicians rushing to his chamber with silver syringes, of servants tasked with carrying away bowls of waste while the king reclined as though this were the most natural ritual in the world. The most powerful monarch in Europe could command armies, move economies, and bend nobles to his will, but he could not command his own bowels. Louis XIV smiled often. His teeth, however, were a battlefield. Neglect and indulgence led to rot, and one by one his teeth blackened and fell out. By middle age, he had almost none left. His gums festered, his jaws sagged, and his breath became infamous. Ambassadors described it as a stench that made conversation unbearable. And yet, courtiers leaned in, nodded, and pretended the odor of rot was sweet incense. To recoil from the king's breath was to risk banishment. Thus, the theater continued. To conceal these flaws, Versailles became the capital of perfume. Flowers were imported by the ton, oils and powders mixed in endless varieties. Whole halls were designed to mask odors with incense and burning herbs. Courtiers dabbed handkerchiefs with lavender before approaching the king. And when all else failed, protocol saved the illusion. Curtains shielded his ailments. Servants whisked away filth in silence. Rules of etiquette ensured that no one spoke of the enemas, the foul breath, the oily skin. What mattered was the appearance: Louis XIV, radiant as the sun, flawless as Apollo, untainted by mortal weakness. but the cracks were growing. Behind the golden mirrors, the Sun King was already rotting. His physicians knew. His closest servants knew. And the smell, yes, the smell, was impossible to fully hide. The courtiers breathed it daily, choking on roses and rot, but none dared admit the truth. Louis had built his reign on theater, and theater demanded silence. To speak of his decay was to break the spell. And yet, we see the spell broken now, don't we? Most people still believe the myth of Louis XIV, the radiant Sun King, the flawless monarch who embodied perfection. That's the story textbooks give. That's the illusion Versailles still sells. But you've stayed long enough to learn what really lay behind the curtains: foul breath, endless enemas, and a king drowning in perfume to mask his decay. By the mid-1680s, Louis XIV had ruled France for more than 4 decades. He was still dazzling, still perfumed, still surrounded by the endless theater of Versailles. But beneath the silks and gold, his body was collapsing. The cracks of his youth, constipation, foul breath, rotting teeth, were nothing compared to what came next. The Sun King developed a wound that would torment him for the rest of his life, an anal fistula. It began innocently enough, with discomfort during his long hours on horseback. Louis complained of sharp pain, swelling, and tenderness in his lower body. At first, physicians whispered that it was hemorrhoids. But soon, the swelling turned into an open sore that oozed pus and blood. The diagnosis was grim: a fistula, an infected tunnel burrowing from the inside of the rectum to the skin. Painful, humiliating, and nearly impossible to cure with 17th-century medicine. For most men, such an affliction meant shame and suffering. But Louis XIV was not most men, he was the Sun King. His wound became a national obsession. Physicians rushed to invent remedies. Enemas had already been part of Louis's daily life, but now they became desperate, applied in endless cycles. Hot irons were pressed against the wound to burn out corruption. Bloodletting sessions drained the king until he was pale and weak. Poultices of herbs, oils, and bizarre concoctions were smeared over his flesh. Some treatments bordered on the absurd. Animal fats were applied directly to the wound. Bull sperm, frog fat, and dove dung were touted as healing salves. Physicians prescribed purges of mercury, believing poison might cleanse infection. Each cure failed. The fistula only deepened, the pus only flowed more, and the king's suffering grew unbearable. At last, the court turned to a man named Charles-François Felix, a royal surgeon with a reputation for steady hands and bold experiments. Felix devised an instrument, a curved scalpel, later called the bistouri à la royale, designed specifically for fistula surgery. But there was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, no pain relief beyond perhaps a splash of brandy. On November 18, 1686, the king was placed on his side. Courtiers and physicians surrounded him. Felix inserted the blade, cutting into the infected flesh. Louis clenched his fists, grinding his teeth as the surgeon sliced open the abscess and drained pus onto soaked cloths. He screamed, groaned, and trembled, but endured. Hours passed as Felix cut, scraped, and probed, hunting for every diseased channel. Blood soaked the sheets. The stench of infection filled the chamber. The Sun King, who had danced for 6 hours without sweat, now lay sweating, pale, and broken under the surgeon's knife. The ordeal wasn't over. Felix declared the wound partially healed, but within weeks the infection returned. More pus, more pain. 2 more surgeries followed, each as brutal as the first. The king endured them awake, conscious of every slice. Courtiers praised his bravery, spreading stories of how he bore the pain like a saint. Pamphlets were printed, songs were sung, and the miraculous cure of the king's fistula became a propaganda triumph. Across France, nobles staged mock fistula surgeries as entertainment, glorifying their king's suffering. Yet the truth was uglier: the wound never healed completely. For the rest of his life, Louis XIV's fistula leaked and ached. He wore bandages beneath his clothes to catch the discharge. Perfume disguised the smell. Protocol ensured no one acknowledged the stains or the wincing shifts in his throne. To the world, Louis emerged triumphant. His surgeries were declared a success, proof of his divine resilience. The Sun King had faced the knife and survived. But behind closed doors, the reality was different. Every movement hurts. Long hours at court were agony. Riding, once his joy, became torture. His appetite waned, his moods darkened. Physicians continued to probe, cauterize, and bleed him, convinced that suffering itself was medicine. And yet, he endured. Louis XIV refused to let the court see weakness. Even when fever racked his body, he sat in council, signed decrees, and presided over rituals. His subjects saw radiance, only his closest servants saw the bandages, the blood, and the exhaustion. The propaganda machine turned the ordeal into legend. Pamphlets depicted Louis as Christ-like, wounded for the good of France. Court poets compared his endurance to Hercules. Physicians who had failed to cure him before now praised Felix as a savior, even though the wound never truly closed. In a twisted way, the fistula strengthened the monarchy. If the king could survive such torment, then surely he was chosen by God. His suffering became another jewel in his crown. But for Louis himself, it was no triumph. It was a lifelong sentence. After the surgeries, Versailles changed. More perfumes were burned, more flowers planted, more incense waved in corridors. The stench of rot and pus followed the king, but etiquette forced silence. Courtiers bowed, smiled, and breathed through handkerchiefs. No one dared acknowledge that the most beautiful king in Europe was rotting from within. By the end of the 1680s, Louis XIV was no longer the radiant Apollo who danced across marble floors. He was heavier, slower, his smile sagging from missing teeth, his body leaking from wounds no surgeon could heal. Yet the theater continued. Versailles glittered. The fountains sang. The king walked through mirrored halls, perfumed and powdered, his subjects dazzled by illusion. But the illusion had a cost. And though the world pretended he was eternal, his body was already betraying him, inch by inch, cut by cut, drop by drop. By the 1690s, the golden image of Louis XIV had grown heavier, slower, and fouler. The boy who once danced ballet for 6 hours straight without breaking a sweat was now a man whose body reeked of sickness, whose teeth had rotted away, whose bowels required daily enemas. And yet, Versailles still sparkled. Courtiers still bowed. Foreign dignitaries still gasped at the sight of the Sun King, resplendent in diamonds and silk. How could this illusion be sustained when the king himself was decaying from within? The answer lay in perfume and protocol. The stench of sickness clung to Louis. His fistula leaked pus. His gums oozed infection where teeth had rotted away. His body sweated oils and sourness that no washing could erase, because, of course, he almost never bathed. So Versailles became a palace of perfume. Rooms were filled with burning incense, bowls of potpourri, and flower garlands imported by the ton. Courtiers drenched themselves in lavender, musk, and rose oils, not only to mask their own odors but to compete with the king's. Whole corridors smelled like an apothecary's workshop. The gardens were cultivated not just for beauty but for fragrance, ensuring that every step toward the king carried the smell of flowers rather than filth. But behind the roses, the stench lingered. Ambassadors privately recorded that Louis XIV smelled like a corpse wrapped in incense. If perfume disguised the odor, protocol disguised the reality. Versailles was built on ritual. Nothing was left to chance, not even how courtiers stood, spoke, or breathed in the king's presence. This strict etiquette created layers of distance between Louis and the outside world, making it nearly impossible for anyone to mention his condition. When the king rose in the morning, courtiers competed for the honor of handing him a glove or holding a sleeve as he dressed. But the curtains of his bedchamber ensured that the filth of his morning routine, bandages removed, enemas applied, wounds cleaned, remained unseen. At meals, courtiers admired his silver dishes piled high with meat and pastries. What they did not see were the private moments when his digestion failed, or when servants discreetly replaced stained linens. Even conversation was a form of protection. To recoil from his breath, to flinch at his odor, was unthinkable. The rules of Versailles demanded silence, smiles, and bows. Protocol, like perfume, preserved the illusion. The years of dental decay left Louis nearly toothless. Surgeons had extracted most of his teeth in brutal procedures, leaving gaping abscesses in his jaw. Eating became a torment. He drooled constantly, his words slurred, his smile sagged. Yet the court adapted. When he spoke, courtiers leaned forward, nodding as though his muffled words were pearls of wisdom. Napkins were tucked discreetly into his lap, servants rushed forward with clothes when saliva spilled onto his silk. In portraits, his smile was painted flawless. In person, it was a drooling grimace. As Louis aged, his body swelled. Decades of feasting left him obese, his once athletic frame ballooning to over 300 pounds. His legs swelled with edema, his gait slowed, and custom chairs were built to bear his weight. And still, Versailles insisted he was beautiful. His portraits showed a tall, commanding figure draped in ermine, untouched by time. Court poets praised his eternal vigor. Courtiers applauded when he walked across a room, as though each step were a victory over mortality. But the truth was whispered in private diaries. The King of France wheezed when he breathed, reeked when he moved, and left sweat stains on the silk cushions of his throne. Foreign ambassadors were perhaps the most honest witnesses. One from Spain recorded that an audience with Louis XIV was an exercise in endurance, not because of politics but because the stench was unbearable. The combination of pus from his fistula, infection from his gums, and sweat from his unwashed body created an odor described as worse than farm animals. Versailles tried to drown it in roses, musk, and incense, but the stench always bled through. And yet, none dared speak. The Sun King still burned too brightly, even as he rotted. The most remarkable part of this charade was not the perfume or the rituals, it was the willingness of everyone around him to believe. Courtiers inhaled smoke and flowers, telling themselves the king smelled divine. They watched him drool and slump, convincing themselves his words still carried power. They saw his swollen frame, his leaking bandages, his festering sores, and yet they bowed lower than ever. It was not just loyalty. It was survival. To acknowledge his decay was to risk exile. And so the illusion held. Louis XIV had always understood power as theater. Versailles itself was designed as a stage, every room a backdrop to his glory. Now, in decay, the theater became more vital than ever. His body was collapsing, but the stage lights still burned. The audience still clapped. The play of perfection went on, night after night, year after year. But beneath the curtains, the king's body told another story, one of rot, of pain, of humanity. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Sun King was no longer radiant. He was heavy, foul-smelling, toothless, and scarred by surgeries. Yet Versailles remained entranced. The rituals continued. The perfumes flowed. The stage lights glowed. The illusion was fragile, but it held. For now. But illusions cannot last forever. By 1715, death itself came for Louis XIV, and not quietly. His final months were marked by a disease so grotesque that even the thick curtains of Versailles could not hide it. His flesh blackened. His leg rotted. The smell of decay filled the palace. And yet, he ruled until the very end. White right pointing backhand index. When a king begins to rot alive, how long can a court pretend he is still divine? By the summer of 1715, Louis XIV had reigned for 72 years, longer than any monarch before him. He had survived wars, conspiracies, revolts, illnesses, and endless surgeries. He had outlived his rivals, his ministers, his siblings, even many of his children. He was, to the world, an unshakable monument of monarchy. But monuments crack. And Louis XIV's body was cracking faster than anyone could disguise. In early August, he complained of sharp pains in his leg. At first, physicians dismissed it as gout, a common ailment of kings who feasted too much. But the pain grew worse. His leg swelled, turned dark, and soon the skin blackened. It was not gout. It was gangrene. The disease spread quickly, consuming his flesh from the foot upward. Black streaks climbed his calf, then his thigh. The skin blistered, split, and peeled away in sheets. His flesh died while still attached to his body, leaving open wounds that leaked pus and blood. The smell was overwhelming. Courtiers fainted in his chambers. Servants gagged. Even physicians covered their faces with perfumed cloths as they leaned over the rotting king. Versailles, once a palace of light and fragrance, became a morgue. Curtains were pulled tight, incense burned constantly, and fresh flowers were carried in daily, only to wilt within hours under the stench of death. Those who entered his room wrote later that the air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Some described it as the smell of death before death. Yet still, the theater continued. Ministers carried in documents for him to sign. Courtiers bowed as they approached his festering bed. They pretended the king was still divine, even as his leg disintegrated before their eyes. The king's physicians, already notorious for bloodletting and brutal remedies, scrambled for solutions. They prescribed purges, enemas, and endless potions. They drained his body of blood, hoping to slow the spread of infection. They applied ointments of herbs and oils, all useless. Desperate, they even debated amputation. But who could amputate the leg of the Sun King? The idea was dismissed. Better a rotting king than a limbless one. So the surgeons watched helplessly as the gangrene spread, their remedies nothing more than cruel rituals. Through the agony, Louis XIV refused to relinquish his throne. He continued to give audiences, signing decrees with trembling hands. Ministers leaned close, pretending not to gag at the stench. Foreign ambassadors were summoned to witness him, to prove that the king still lived. They saw a swollen, blackened body wrapped in silks, a man in constant agony, eyes clouded with fever. And yet, he spoke with authority, reminding them that France still had a king. Even as his body rotted, his will remained iron. The worse the disease grew, the more Versailles struggled to hide it. Buckets of flowers filled every corner. Linen sheets were changed constantly, yet within hours they stank. Incense burned day and night until courtiers coughed from the smoke. But nothing worked. The smell seeped into tapestries, curtains, and clothing. It spread down the corridors, through the gardens, even into the courtiers' wigs and gowns. Some claimed they could smell death from the gates of Versailles. The Palace of Light had become a palace of decay. Louis's decline became a public spectacle. News of his condition spread across France, and people gathered outside Versailles, waiting for updates. Rumors flew. The king was already dead, the king was cured, the king's leg had fallen off. Inside, nobles whispered prayers, while others quietly schemed for power. Everyone knew the Sun King's reign was ending. But no one dared admit it aloud. Not yet. By late August, Louis was bedridden. His leg was nearly consumed by gangrene, his flesh black, his body feverish and swollen. He drifted in and out of delirium, crying out from the pain, calling for priests, muttering about his sins. Courtiers watched from behind curtains, horrified but silent. For decades, they had worshipped the illusion of perfection. Now, the illusion was rotting in front of them. And yet, still, the show went on. Ministers bowed. Servants burned incense. The Sun King's glory was kept alive, even as the man himself decayed into a corpse that still breathed. At this point in the story, most people would turn away. They'd say, "Enough. This is too grotesque, too revolting." But not you. You've stayed. You've seen behind the curtains, smelled the perfumes masking pus, and watched the Sun King's glory collapse into blackened flesh. You've endured the part of history that most books leave out. That makes you different. That makes you the hero of this journey. Because while Louis XIV's courtiers bowed to illusions, you faced the truth. You didn't look away. What did his autopsy reveal? How fast did his body decompose? And how did Versailles, this palace of perfume and power, handle the explosion of rot that came after death? On September 1st, 1715, the sun finally set. Louis XIV, King of France, ruler of Versailles, the man who had declared himself divine, took his last rattling breath. He had been king for 72 years, the longest reign in European history. And yet, in those final moments, he was not the radiant Apollo, not the golden monarch. He was a man rotting alive. For weeks, Versailles had lived in a state of suffocation. The king's gangrenous leg filled the palace with a smell so overpowering that even flowers, incense, and perfume could not mask it. Courtiers wore handkerchiefs soaked in lavender, physicians stuffed herbs in their nostrils, and servants fled the chamber gagging. Louis himself drifted in and out of agony. Some days, he summoned ministers, demanding updates on wars and finances, determined to show that he still ruled. Other days, he lay sweating and feverish, calling for priests and whispering confessions of his sins. He had outlived his eldest son, his brother, and nearly every close relative. Only his great-grandson, a frail child of 5, stood to inherit the throne. Louis gathered his family and ministers to his bedside and gave his last political command: "Do not imitate me in my love of war. It has been my ruin." It was one of the few moments of humility in a life built on grandeur. On the morning of September 1st, the agony reached its climax. Louis lay in silks, his leg blackened to the hip, his body swollen and leaking fluids. Courtiers and clergy surrounded him, whispering prayers and watching for signs of death. At 8:15 a.m., the king's chest rose one final time. His eyes glazed, his lips parted, and a last, rattling breath escaped. The Sun King was gone. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Then the rituals began. The court wept, priests intoned prayers, and ministers bowed their heads. Versailles had lost its god. But death did not bring peace. It brought a new horror. Royal custom demanded an autopsy. Physicians gathered around the corpse, knives in hand, while courtiers stood nearby, desperate to know the secrets of their king's body. What they found shocked even the hardened surgeons. The gangrene had spread throughout his body. His organs were blackened, riddled with infection. His stomach was bloated and filled with foul matter. His gums were ulcerated, his jawbone eaten away by rot. And coiled in his intestines, they found something worse, a tapeworm, several feet long, that had lived inside him for years, feeding on the king himself. The most beautiful king in Europe had died as a host to parasites, his flesh rotting from within. The body of Louis XIV did not wait for burial to reveal its corruption. Within hours of death, his corpse began to swell. Gases from decomposition filled the chest cavity, making the body expand grotesquely inside the coffin. Witnesses described gurgling noises from the corpse, as though it were alive and moaning. The stench grew so overwhelming that courtiers fainted. Priests waved incense frantically, but the air itself seemed poisoned. By the second day, the skin blackened and split. Liquids seeped through the coffin. Versailles became a palace of rot once more, not from a living king, but from his corpse. The government panicked. Louis XIV's reign had been one long performance of glory. To end it with the stench of rot was unthinkable. Records of the autopsy were censored, details hidden. Official reports spoke of a pious, peaceful death. Pamphlets praised his endurance, his wisdom, his eternal majesty. But the truth had already slipped out. Ambassadors wrote home of the unbearable stench, the blackened corpse, the parasites in his gut. In whispered gossip, Louis was no longer the Sun King. He was the king who had rotted alive. On September 9th, after days of chaos, the body was finally buried in the Basilica of Saint Denis, the traditional resting place of French kings. The coffin was carried through crowds of mourners who sobbed and prayed. But even then, the smell followed. The cortege stank of decomposition, and some spectators turned their faces away. The golden age of Versailles had ended in the smell of rot. Louis XIV had believed himself immortal, a man chosen by God to shine like the sun forever. He built Versailles as a palace of illusions, filled with mirrors, perfumes, and rituals to convince the world of his perfection. But the truth of his death shattered that illusion. Beneath the silks and perfumes, he was flesh, and flesh rots. Yet, in a way, the myth endured. Portraits still show him radiant, statues still depict him as Apollo, and history books still call him the Sun King. His glory was remembered, his stench was buried. Unless you know the story. Unless you remember. And now you do. You've walked with me from the dazzling youth of Louis XIV to his grotesque death. You've seen the beauty, the illusions, the fistula, the gangrene, the tapeworm, and finally, the collapse of a legend. Most people never get this far. They stop at the golden portraits, the glittering Versailles, the myth of the perfect king. But you stayed until the end. You faced the stench, the pus, the rot. That makes you different. That makes you the keeper of the truth. And here's where you come in. Because if you've made it this far, you already know how fragile illusions are, and how easily history buries the grotesque, the uncomfortable, the real. By watching, you've kept the truth of Louis XIV alive. But if you stop here, the illusion takes over again. White right pointing backhand index, so don't let it. Like this video, because every click tells the world that history isn't just golden halls and pretty paintings. Subscribe, because there are more stories like this, darker, stranger, and truer than you've ever heard.